My name's Joe, and I'd like to welcome you to the Miller House Museum. And on behalf of myself and the staff, have a holly jolly Christmas. If you haven't had any of the treats yet, we'll wish you a holly jolly Christmas once again when you do. First of all, if I may, small announcement. Our next show, April 15th, Danny Rader, Grass Between the Rails, another Humanities Iowa program. They're always good. This program celebrates... Pardon me. Hang on a second. Let me get this. No. Okay, well, I'll remind everybody. Thanks for calling. Please set your phones to wiggle. Don't let this happen to you. Okay, that wasn't reaching too far for a gag, was it? Some people think it is, you know. I think it hits the spot every time. Well, anyway, real quick to get back. Danny Rader, Grass Between the Rails, Humanities Iowa program, as is our program today. It celebrates Iowa's railroad history, and lucky you're sitting down, in story and song. Ooh. So this guy's kind of like the Gene Autry of Iowa Rail, I guess. He's going to be doing some local stuff and some genuine Iowa stuff as well. And now, often when you're stuck in this position, as I am, by the way, here's the thing. Even if it's a presidential election, don't bet on what you think is a sure thing, because you might lose and then you'll be stuck announcing programs like I am. Okay. Originally from Des Moines, Tom Milligan has lived in the Amana Colony since 2006. He has been a working actor, director, scenic designer, and producer for the last 45 years. His resume is a roll call of Des Moines and Amana Colony's area theaters, including Charlie's Showplace Dinner Theater, the Des Moines Playhouse, Ingersoll Dinner Theater, Drake Opera, Drama Workhouse, the Old Creamery Theater, the Iowa Artists Company, as well as many other arts groups around the state. Tom joined Humanities Iowa Speakers Bureau 18 years ago, and with his one-man show, Grant Wood, Prairie Rebel. Since then, he has added 2 more presentations to his offering. You know, I usually ad-lib these things and they work out so much fun. In 2016, Humanities Iowa partnered with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources to invite Tom to write and perform this presentation about J.N. Ding Darling. We'll all find out. 2-time Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial cartoonist for the Des Moines Register, as well as a nationally known conservationist. Good for you, my friend. This one-act play entitled The Art of Conservation, A Visit with Ding Darling, was first presented at the 2016 Iowa State Fair and has been touring with Iowa shows. And it's booked till 2019. So lucky you got your tickets here today. Today's program is part of the Democracy and the Informed Citizen Initiative, administered by the Federal State Humanities Council. The initiative seeks to deepen the public's knowledge and appreciation of a vital connection between democracy, the humanities, journalism, and an informed citizenry. We thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Have you ever wondered what the W stood for? Because it stands for water, I think it's hilarious. The Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. It's right here. I didn't make that up. It wouldn't occur to me. You know, for their generous support of this initiative and the Pulitzer Prize for their partnership. And this, it's written down here, but this comes right from my heart, and I think everyone feels the same way. What better way to learn history than to hear from the person who helped create that history? So please welcome J. Ding Darling. Thank you.
I'm sorry for the interruption. My assistant Merle always opens my mail for me and lets me know if there's anything that needs my immediate attention, so there must be something here that's important. She handles most of the business outside of this office, with the exception of phone calls, which I still prefer to take myself. Now, where were we? Oh, of course, February 7th, 1936. Many people looked at that date. The conclusion of the first North American Wildlife Conference is the beginning of the modern conservation movement in this country. But it was really so much more. If you take a closer look, it was in fact the beginning of an era, aided by cooperation, an understanding, and education, in which we began to restore one of the few commodities that man and all of his capabilities, is still unable to manufacture the wildlife and natural resources that surround us. So with the words spoken by Conference Chairman F.A. Silcox, J. Darling, God bless you, the baby is now yours, I was handed the reins of what would eventually become the National Wildlife Federation. Of course, the events of that day and what would happen in the years to follow had actually been set in motion many years before. 1876, the centennial of our great country, and of course my birth in Norwood, Michigan. Now, you may remember that my father, the Reverend Marcellus Darling, had traveled to many congregations before finally settling in Sioux City, Iowa, somewhere around my 10th birthday. Why, Sioux City, Iowa, in the late 1800s, that was a town that was set on the edge of the Wild West, with an unusual blend of big city problems and conflicts, while at the same time surrounded by wide open prairies, clear flowing streams and rivers, and abundance of wildlife and migratory waterfowl. So for the next 20 years or so, those two very opposite worlds would shape the twists and the turns of the roads down which my life would travel. It isn't hard to imagine why, as a boy of a certain age, once I was finally turned loose, I was drawn to those open spaces beyond the Big Sioux River into South Dakota, where great flocks of birds moved across the land. In the fall, prairie chickens sought cover in the thickets along the creeks and the marshes. It was the smell of the tall grass after a summer rain. It was the sound of the red-winged blackbirds that made the cattails along the banks come alive. All of this existing under a canopy of an endless clear blue sky that I witnessed. My mind became filled with all of these images that have never been erased. It was the gradual disappearance of all of this wonderful endowment of nature that stirred my first instincts towards conservation. But it was really a trip back to Michigan, where I truly began to understand the negative impact that our lack of knowledge and unwise use of our natural resources had on our responsibility towards land stewardship. I spent many summers back in Albion, Michigan, helping my Uncle John work his beautiful farm. I always thought that my Iowa farmer here always reminded me of Uncle John a little bit. As a teenager, it was like paradise. Acres of rich farmland surrounded by timber and streams and wildlife. The work was hard. It was demanding. But for a young boy, it was rewarding in so many ways. I began to see how all of these images that I carried in my head worked together. All of the elements around us working together to create a world of boundless opportunities with mankind reaping the benefits. I returned to Michigan after a 12-year absence from my Uncle John's funeral. It seemed as if everything had changed, but not for the good. It was as if the farm had died right alongside my uncle. The topsoil had been stripped away, the timber cut, the streams muddied, no sign of the wildlife that had once populated the land. The beautiful, carefully maintained land was gone. This was my first conscious realization of what could happen to the soil, to the water, to plant life, to human life, if the common laws of Mother Nature were disregarded. The contrast between what it had been and what it had become remained with me for the rest of my days. But back in Sioux City, everything was still fresh and new, the land of the West still untouched. But for how long? I spoke up about what I had witnessed in Michigan, the issues of the land, as in many of our country's founding fathers, fearful what had happened to my uncle's farm would be repeated. My concerns were met with comments like, well, Uncle Sam's rich enough to give us our own farm, let us get ours while the getting is good. All it takes to be a good conservationist is to have been awake and witnessed what has happened to our minerals, our trees, our soil, our water, our plant life, animal life over the last 50 years, and you'll be a conservationist from fright. That was me. But for all of this indifference, I still found that Sioux City remained a part of the roadmap of my life. Eventually finding myself in the right place at the right time with a college education as broad as the open prairies. Medicine had always been an interest of mine. A goal that just always seemed just slightly out of reach. But for that, I would have to work, set aside a little money. It was then that I was offered a job that, well, it actually became more than a job. It became a career. No, it became a passion, a platform in which I could reflect upon the triumphs and the failings of mankind, influence presidents and public opinion, and in some small way make a difference. I was offered a job by the local newspaper, the Sioux City Journal, as a cub reporter, with emphasis on cub rather than reporter. But my keen sense of observation and unbridled curiosity quickly made up for whatever traits I lacked in moving into the newspaper world. As I said, Sioux City was a bit of the Wild West back in those days, and stories that I was assigned to cover reflected that wide open town of the early 1900s. Saloons, even open on Sunday, were everywhere. Gambling and the occasional house of prostitution was just part of my daily beat. Typical morning would find me following the local authorities out to pull a body found floating in the Big Sioux River there from the night before. Crime had made that area of town a very dangerous place to be at times. We'd pull a stiff out of the water once every 3 or 4 mornings. Always made for a good story. Well, especially if the corpse could be identified. But finding bodies with the police wasn't the only thing I discovered at my time at the Journal. Very short order, I became very appreciative of its owner and editor, George D. Perkins, the character and the principles that he displayed, not only as a respected man of the community, but within the newspaper business, proved invaluable as I started down my journalistic road. But as a young man, I did have other interests besides just working the day away. Well, ever since an early age, I'd always had an interest in the musical arts. Starting out as a young boy, continuing on into my college days and into adulthood, I took the opportunity to join the choir at the St. Thomas Episcopal Church, where I sang bass, and eventually became the director of the choir. Later on, when I submitted my letter of resignation, I received a note asking me to reconsider and stay, but I'd already decided to leave, much to the disappointment of the 34 people who had signed the note. I may have left the choir, but I never left the music. Yeah, it just seemed like as if I tried to pack as much into one day as I possibly could. Starting out first thing in the morning, covering the latest news of the city, to continue on into the day to pursue other pastimes. Typical routine would find me putting the paper to bed around midnight. In a group of us, we'd pile into a buckboard, head out to the flats west of Sioux City. We spent hours hunting and fishing in the thousands of unspoiled acres west of Sioux City. I don't know how I got along with so little sleep in those days. Well, I suppose it was good practice for whatever lay ahead down the road. Yeah, as I said, I was a young man with many interests, and one of my favorites probably helped land my job at the Journal. Now, as a young boy, I had acquired a box camera, very similar to this, only much bigger. You know, I just don't know how they make cameras so small these days. Anyway, I began exploring the world around me through photography. Now, one of the areas that I was assigned to cover on a regular basis was the proceedings inside our local courthouse, writing lively accounts of events that went on inside those hallowed walls of justice. Well, after having written one such story, my editor ordered me to go back the next day with my camera to capture an exciting moment to run with the next day's edition. Well, I hauled my bulky equipment up the stairs, I set up my camera and waited for just the right moment, but before I could get a shot off, one of the attorneys spotted me. And he let out a whoop, chased me out of the courtroom, down the stairs, out to the street. When I arrived back at the Journal, I had my story, but no photograph to accompany it for the next day's edition. You know, when I think back now, the solution to that problem probably changed the course of my newspaper career as much as my visit to my Uncle John's farm changed my views on conservation and wildlife around us. Painting, sketching, drawing had always been part of what I'd always enjoyed, rarely without a sketch pad in hand, always working to capture the right moment and the people around me. Now, many of those sheets and scraps of notebook paper filled with those images had found their way back to my desk at the Journal. Among them, I found an image of the attorney that I had worked on earlier, the one who had been so agitated in the courtroom. So with the approval of the editor, they ran my artwork the next day with the story. Well, it created such a stir that they began to run my artwork on a regular basis, leading to a series called Local Snapshots, and eventually another one titled Interviews That Never Happened. When I think back now, it's almost as if one of the two roads that was my life had taken a severe turn and sent it headlong towards the other. Well, over time, my work at the Journal began to attract attention outside of the Sioux City area. Even though there were many topics available for developing my cartooning skills, I always found the little poke of fun in a political figure or editorializing on a grander scale was not only what I enjoyed the most, what also had the most attention. Soon, other newspapers began to take interest to the point where, after 6 years with the Journal, I was offered a job as the editorial cartoonist for the Des Moines Register and Leader. I had arrived in Sioux City, a wide-eyed 10-year-old boy, and was now leaving a young man on a mission, which really had yet to be defined. But I wasn't leaving alone. Remember, I did say I had other interests. I married Miss Genevieve Pennington on October 31st, 1906, and we have remained at each other's side from that moment on. Penny, as everyone calls her, became my constant support. The mother of our 2 children, John first, and then 3 years later, Mary, became my fellow world traveler. Some of our best times were spent traveling the globe, to include the West Indies on our honeymoon. I actually met her through an old college friend when Penny moved to Sioux City to stay with relatives. As she became interested in my artwork, all of which contained some sort of written message or the stories that I wrote, she found great amusement in my tendency to misspell words. Always trying to correct the error of my ways, I always assured her that anyone who couldn't spell a word at least 2 different ways really didn't show much imagination. We were actually on that honeymoon when I received my telegram offering me the position at the Register. But things worked out again. Right place, right time. Apparently, back in Sioux City, one of the subjects of one of my local snapshots, the president of the local school board, had created such an uproar that it led to my release from the Journal. So with sketchpad and pens in hand, Penny and I started down our new road to Des Moines. Although I knew I was moving on to a much larger arena, I never stopped carrying in my mind the images of the wide open prairies and wetlands of my youth. More than ever, my artwork and commentary began to express the need to work together to save that one commodity which we were still unable to manufacture. The wildlife and natural resources that surround us with all of its God-given beauty, with mankind as the sole beneficiary. Well, this is interesting. I've only mentioned my college days in passing, but one of the letters this morning is an invitation to a reunion back at my alma mater, Beloit College in Wisconsin. Now, I did graduate, in somewhat of an unorthodox fashion. Now, I enrolled, just as all young men did, but very quickly the extracurricular activities soon began to outweigh the actual attention to classwork. I started playing instruments in different bands. I started singing in different vocal groups. I actually got a job as the art editor for the local yearbook, the Codex. Well, very quickly, the pages of the Codex were filled with very rough but easily recognizable images of the college's professors, to include the president, portraying them as everything from the devil to male ballet dancers dressed in tutus standing in line. Created quite a stir on the relatively conservative campus. After the next faculty meeting, the minutes read, "It was voted that Mr. Darwin be suspended for a year due to irregularities in attendance and poor scholarship." Well, I did go back and graduate after that year, which is probably what prompted this invitation. The fact of the matter was, I just wasn't a very good student. You know, but there was one thing that did come out of that episode that stayed with me for the rest of my days. In a somewhat vain attempt to hide the identity of the yearbook's contributing artist, I shortened my last name. I removed the ARL and replaced it with an apostrophe. So it became D''ing. As a result, I would become known locally as J. Ding Darling. But eventually around the globe, everyone knew me just as Ding. When I arrived at the Des Moines Register and Leader, I couldn't have found myself in more capable, welcoming arms than those of the publisher and editor, Gardner Coles. It almost seemed as if we were cut from the same cloth. Our backgrounds and experiences were matched only by our need to see this joint commitment to see this struggling newspaper survive in spite of all of its own internal problems. Both Coles and I shared the same need. We both of our needs depended on that newspaper to become a well-respected member of the journalistic world. But what appealed to my senses most in starting into this new arena was the immediate editorial freedom that I began to feel. Coles gave me free rein to express my views, even though they never did quite match up sometimes with the less conservative views of the rest of the editorial staff. Very short time, my daily front page cartoons dealing with everything from policies to politics to conservation became a morning ritual for the ever-growing number of registered and leader subscribers. For both Coles and I, our efforts began to pay off. My first cartoon appeared on October 31st, 1906 and was met with an immediate negative reaction. Somehow, without actually meaning to, I had somehow managed to offend both the soft coal industry of Des Moines as well as the Roman Catholic Church. Now, although both sides expressed their discomfort with being associated with one another and my apparent misunderstanding of the meaning of the word Des Moines, I was more concerned about upsetting the church than I was the pollution-producing soft coal industry. It was my first cartoon in Des Moines, and people would see what would become my no-holds-barred, tell-it-like-it-is, down-to-earth approach that I would take on people and events of the day. Famous people and their actions, or sometimes their inactions, became the source of many of my cartoons. Over time, I came to work with many national influential leaders. Some of the men I got to know first as friends, men that I respected, two of which would go on to become President of the United States. But I still respected them. One such person was Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, the man who would become my friend, who I would ride horses with at Oyster Bay and eventually become President of the United States, represented everything I saw, both good and bad, about the conservation movement in this country. He was a staunch conservationist whose strong political influences are still felt today. It was once said, with only slight exaggeration, you can date the beginning of the modern conservation movement in this country to the arrival of Theodore Roosevelt in the West. Teddy spent many summers ranching in the hills of western North Dakota near Medora. He was surrounded by the beautiful landscape and the beauty of the land and the wildlife. Well, it was the same experience that I'd had in the land west of Sioux City growing up as a young boy. We both saw the beauty of the land, the need to keep it protected, as if untouched. We also saw the effect of man, and the impact of civilization. Ted left a deep impact and an endless resolve. His mission for conservation education and working together to save the beauty of the land eventually helped lead to the creation of the National Park Service to include a national park that bears his name in those same North Dakota hills. We remained friends over the years. He appeared in my cartoons many, many times, mostly in the political arena where no one spared the wrath or humor of my pen. I was actually working on a deadline and utter exhausted from commuting back and forth between New York and Des Moines when I heard a faint knocking on the outer door of my office. It was my editor with news that would put me into an emotional coma. Theodore Roosevelt had died that morning, and I was to drop everything that I was doing and come up with something appropriate to run as a tribute in the next day's edition. Well, finding everything that I started all fell short of the mark and ended up on the floor around my drawing table, we decided to go with the first image that I had created with plans to improve upon it at a later date. It was a simple image. Roosevelt on horseback, hat in hand, thrust high in the air, that farewell salute I'd seen him give so many times before. Behind him, Washington, D.C., Capitol on the horizon. And over his shoulder in the clouds, a wagon train moving west of the North Dakota hills. The simple caption read, "The long, long trail." This rather hurried attempt to create anything memorable was met with such immediate universal praise there was no attempt to even improve upon it at a later date. It is still viewed in more public places and reproduced more than any other cartoon that I ever created. What I found happening in Des Moines was that just like in Sioux City, my contribution to the newspaper took on a far wider audience than I or anyone else at the paper ever imagined. My cartoons weren't there to make people laugh or to smile, but to think and to feel and to question the wider world around them. The issues I drew, they shone a light on important but sometimes overlooked topics of the day and shone a light on the way that the average daily reader could understand them. My messages weren't confined just to the city of Des Moines or even the borders of the state of Iowa, but there were national concerns that spoke to the greater good of the nation, which was rapidly becoming my ever-growing audience. That road that had started out in Sioux City that eventually led to Des Moines over time included stops at the New York Globe, New York Herald Tribune, the Herald Tribune syndicates, and many other syndicated newspapers within those organizations. But I always found the road always led me back to Des Moines. At no other newspaper did I find the editorial freedom that I found at the Des Moines Register. You know, although the move to New York City was a great step up the journalistic ladder, there was always something about it that never felt quite right. Penny and I, we settled into our new home, had our daughter Mary, traveled in the circle of many national influential friends, tried to adjust to our life away from Iowa. Well, I found the newspaper business of New York to be a closed-off, impersonal world compared to the down-to-earth attitudes of the Midwest. The freedom that I had felt at the Des Moines Register was quickly replaced by the desire for me to choose subject matter which more closely related to the editorial views of the newspaper, to include a comic strip, which I adamantly resisted. Finally, after 2 years, Penny and I, we returned to Iowa and the Register. Although from that point on, my work would take me many places on our travels around the world, from that point on, we always proudly considered Des Moines, Iowa, our home. Didn't take long to settle back in here behind my desk on the 11th floor of the Des Moines Register, and also to take up some of those other outside activities I always enjoyed as a boy. I joined the Wakanda Saddle Club. I actually helped start the first Iowa chapter of the Isaac Walton League. You know, I was one of the first Iowans to get a pilot's license to learn how to fly. I have a picture of me around here somewhere, aviator outfit on, leather helmet, goggles and all. Remind me sometime, I'll see if I can find it. You know, all of the times that I drew, all of my drawings didn't always contain the famous and influential people, but sometimes people just important as well. My family. I remember a time I drew a picture for John when he was away at college. It was actually an image of me pushing a large wheelbarrow up a hill with a Valentine as its load. Sometimes my grandson would receive messages from me in art form, such as a big elephant looking down at a small child with the caption reading, "Hello, Kippy, give me a peanut." I did a lot of my work at our home there on Terrace Road in Des Moines, a second floor nook called Monk's Corner. Many times I'd sit down below that corner, I'd play my accordion, waiting for ideas to float up to the drawing table. I've learned much from the lessons of life, but one of the most important is that strength of and love for family is paramount in building a successful society. Those are good words, even for today. Well, back now at the Register, what had started out in Sioux City as an occasional poke of fun at a political figure or the comment on the nature of society within a given community took on a much wider commentary. I began every day by reading at least 6 newspapers. I called upon the workings of medicine and biology and the books of the Bible. My keen sense of observation and the love of out of doors to inspire the images that I created. And it seemed like there was no place in greater need of attention than the Midwest in the 1920s. I tried to use my influence to address issues as complex as conservation, the draining and tilling of wetlands. I took on the plight of the wildlife population and unrestricted warfare on migratory waterfowl, on the struggles of the Midwest farmer and his family in the middle of the coming Depression. I challenged daily the political environment in Washington, D.C. on all of these issues, as well as many other issues at the time. The 40-hour work week, antitrust laws, the policies of Roosevelt's New Deal, international neutrality, as well as issues facing them right there in their own backyard. Poor roads, harsh winters, and the personal cost of war. But more than the issues, it was sometimes the people behind them. the policymakers, the people making the decisions, that was the focus of my work. But I also looked for the good in people as well. In fact, it was probably that focus that helped me win my first Pulitzer Prize in 1924 for cartooning. Quite an honor for a young boy from Sioux City with a sketch pad under his arm. In the good old USA was a four-frame cartoon paying respect to three men of honor. Herbert Hoover, mining engineer and economist, Dr. Frederick Peterson, neurologist, and Warren G. Harding, President of the United States. Each frame depicted their lowly, humble beginnings, as well as their humanitarian contribution to mankind. The final frame read, "But they didn't get there by hanging around the corner drugstore." A comment on hard work and a life well lived. I received my second Pulitzer Prize in 1942, and to be perfectly honest with you, at the time, I didn't really remember drawing it. It wasn't until I went back to my files that I found the image of Washington, D.C. and the Capitol buried under mountains of paperwork and reports that took the prize. Although I have to tell you, I did question the members of the panel that it was the best cartoon of the year. But I took the prize anyway. You know, over the years, many people appeared in my drawings many times, mostly for their questionable deeds and actions, but sometimes people appeared for their good work as well. You know, one such repeat face was that of Herbert Hoover. Fellow Iowan and former future president, he met him when he was 1919 in Des Moines. We became good friends, and I approved of most of the policies that he initiated. Even our families became good friends. In fact, after a visit to the White House shortly after the inaugural by our family, Mrs. Hoover wrote, "With warmest regards to Mr. and Mrs. Darling and the two dinglings." I'm reminded of the time when he and I went horseback riding in the Great Smoky Mountains. With great effort, we were able to separate ourselves away from Herbie's bodyguards, and we spent the day at the top of the mountain alone. The wonderful view, the fishing for our lunch, and companionship was topped only by watching the Secret Service agents on horseback below us scouring the area looking for him. It's the only time I ever saw the man totally happy and unrestrained. Oh, remind me sometime, and I'll tell you a story about a pact between Mrs. Hoover and myself in regards to the way that I signed my name. It's really a great story. Well, it seemed that no matter how many leaders I drew or how many issues I brought to the attention of my readers, especially in the area of conservation, very little was being done. The Pulitzer Prize winning cartoon had yet to be drawn that could save the dwindling duck population or the wetlands to which they had migrated. But then suddenly something happened. That those two roads that I'd been traveling had come together and started to make a difference. Now, at the time, most state conservation policies dealt with short-term programs, and it was clear that they needed to be replaced with long-range planning and protecting our natural resources and carried out by qualified men in the field, not some politician only interested in a 4-year term. In short, politics needed to be taken out of the picture. Now, in 1931, the Iowa General Assembly established the first Iowa State Fish and Game Commission, of which I became a member, and after some initial confusing, chaired the group as its first commissioner. Finally, after all this time, the cartoonist had become the conservationist. The first real issue we faced in 1932 was one that I really hadn't expected, but actually opened the door to one of the leading issues at the time in conservation: the lack of education. Now, the reality, as a non-political group, there was not just enough specially trained people to run the programs, scientifically trained people to run the programs, as well as do the administrative work for the commission. So after giving it some thought, I felt that there was only one thing to do. So, a proposal in hand, I headed off to Ames, Iowa to visit Mr. R.M. Hughes, the president of Iowa State College. Now, the plan was for a joint 3-year program between the commission and the college, aiding and assisting students who were studying wildlife conservation. Now, the college would provide the services, salaries, and facilities valued at $10,000, and the commission would be responsible for securing another $6,000. I was so convinced of this that I donated $9,000 of my own money over a 3-year time just to make sure that this program worked. Dr. Paul Arrington, former student of nationally known conservationist Aldo Leopold, became the first leader of the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit. Together, we began to train the leaders who would train the leaders who would lead the conservation fight in the future. It was the beginning of an era of cooperation and understanding in which we began to lead the way in conservation in the United States, and Iowa was on the forefront leading that fight. Under the direction of Aldo Leopold, we began working on a 25-year comprehensive conservation program for the people right here in the state of Iowa. The merging of several conservation groups became out of that commission's recommendations. We were starting to make a difference. People were starting to notice, and the politicians were beginning to pay attention. But 1932 also saw the Franklin Roosevelt tide sweep over my friend Herbert Hoover, and now all of a sudden we had a new administration in the White House. Now, it isn't any secret to anyone who reads my cartoons that Franklin Roosevelt's policies is not exactly what I thought this country needed in the middle of the coming Depression, as well as the Dust Bowl. My relatively conservative ideas always seemed to run contrary to Roosevelt's policies, which to me seemed like a welfare state in the making. But while in Iowa our conservation projects still started to move forward under Roosevelt, it seemed like that they were starting to become stagnant. To the point where in 1934, at the urging of Henry A. Wallace, a former Iowan and Secretary of Agriculture, Franklin Roosevelt appointed me to what became known as the Beck Commission. Now, this three-person commission, which included my working partner Aldo Leopold, was assigned to look at the policies regarding the conservation of wildlife, migratory wildlife, which was under the U.S. Biological Survey's jurisdiction. We were also asked to recommend programming as well as additional funding. What happened over the next 3 months was a very contentious exchange between the U.S. Biological Survey, the Beck Commission, and the Roosevelt administration, not only on the policies that existed within the programs, but the inability of the men of the U.S. Biological Survey to do the job that they had been assigned to do. Nobody could agree. Everybody had different opinions. Even the three of us on the commission had a different opinion, with each of us submitting our own written report, with mine asking for an additional funding for which we had the president's promise of $1 million. When I arrived back in Des Moines, it seemed like very little had been done. I hadn't been back here at my desk very long when, much to my surprise, I received a telephone call from Henry A. Wallace telling me that Franklin Roosevelt wanted to appoint me as the chief of the U.S. Biological Survey, the same commission that I had helped to investigate. Strange bedfellows indeed. The relatively conservative cartoonist turned conservationist and the liberal New Deal Democratic president. But what I saw was an opportunity to take my advocacy for all of these issues to a much broader audience. But I always wondered whether or not Roosevelt gave me that job just to take my cartoons, many of which contained an anti-Roosevelt message, off on the front pages for a while. But I took the job anyway. When I arrived in D.C. to take over that job, it seemed like the conservation of wildlife, which more had been said and less done than anything else in the world other than the weather, was an unorganized, unfunded department with no central focus. People really didn't care what was going on in North Dakota, let alone the fields and streams in their own backyard. There was all these little groups all over the country that had their own little focus of what they were doing relative just to their spot. There was no long-range plan like the one that we had set up in Iowa. There were issues that needed to be addressed in all of these areas by conservationists and hunters and the people who wrote the laws. My time at the U.S. Biological Survey, which is now, of course, known as the U.S. Fish and Game Service, was short, but productive. In a very short time, we not only began to save the land, but we began to regrow the prairies and restore the wetlands. We established a wildlife refuge system across the country for the wildlife migratory waterfowl, which had become part of a repopulation effort. We raised the awareness of endangered species and the need to protect our natural resources, which had been the subject of many of my cartoons. But for a program that had remained stagnant over the years, so had the funding for the programs that had never really been started. So in an effort to self-fund ourselves, I started the Federal Migratory Bird Hunting Stamp Program. The duck stamp, as it became known, provided valuable aid to existing programs. Although we eventually did receive some federal funding somewhat reluctantly, it was the duck stamp, first issued in 1936, featuring one of my many duck drawings, that has funded that program for decades and still continues to this very day. But beside all this success, there were still problems. It seems like everywhere around the country, there were all these little groups that were getting started. And as our efforts increased, we saw an increase in those small groups, but only dealing with the problems in their own specific area. But they all seemed to deal with the same issue that we had dealt with early on: the lack of trained, educated people to run the programs. The problem solved for us by the wildlife, the unit that we had established at Iowa State College, which still continued to grow and prosper. There were issues that needed to be addressed in all of these areas by conservationists and hunters and sportsmen and people who wrote the laws. I was enthused that there appeared to be a move towards a federal education in that area. The thing was that everybody had started to get excited about this, and the need for heavy lifting on a larger scale was becoming evident. But the one problem that remained is that exploiters of our natural resources are always organized and conservationists never. 11 million horses running wild couldn't pull a rubber-tired baby buggy to town without a harness to hook them to the load. Likewise, 11 million sportsmen and 36,000 scattered sports groups need the same kind of harness to band them together for the good and the united effort of wildlife. And that brings me back to your question about February 3rd, 1936. What happened on that day actually had us beginning back in April of the year before. As the chief of the U.S. Biological Survey, I called for and chaired a meeting at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. In attendance were owners and representatives of some of the nation's leading arms and ammunition manufacturers, conservationists, wildlife advocates, hunters, all finally agreeing not only to work together, but to provide the initial funding for a centralized clearinghouse on all of these issues. Educational units like the one that we had set up at Iowa State College would be grown in colleges around the nation. The meeting was an outstanding success and eventually led to the first National Wildlife Conference. We started something that just a few short decades before seemed as far out of reach as my medical dreams as a young boy. But with the images of those wide open prairies still in my head, working in a non-political way, we brought together the number of groups, the variety of people, all with different ideas, different agendas. We not only began to save the land, but we began to restore the land that our founding fathers had seen so many years before in this country. After my time with the National Wildlife Federation, it seemed that wherever Penny and I went, my art and conservation always seemed to be the subject of my life. My ongoing problems with health, including bronchitis, eventually led to us heading south to the warm water and the warm weathers of Florida, where we found our own refuge in a structure called the Fish House. I actually sat in the water off of the shores of Sanibel Island up on stilts. The only way you could reach it was by a drawbridge. Penny was not enthused about doing household chores and other duties in such a remote location, so it eventually became just a part-time refuge for our family and a growing number of friends. But what we found was that the waters and the shoreline in that area needed the same kind of attention as the plains and the prairies had up north. If something didn't happen there, then the beauty of that land would be lost as well. So I turned my attention towards some far-reaching, far-thinking ideas that are still felt there today. What had started out in Iowa so many years before had now become part of the national conscience. From the shores around Sanibel Island and Captiva through the North Dakota hills once ranched by my friend and inspiration Theodore Roosevelt, where all of this effort began, to the Oregon shoreline, our work still continues to shine. But we do not do it alone. We do it together. Partisan politics set aside. Egos left at the door. A what's in this for everyone were attitudes that worked at that time and in that moment, and right now, today, mankind is still reaping the benefits of that cooperation. If there should ever be a return of conservation to politics, I'll turn over in my grave if you don't stand up and fight. Oh my. Where did the time go? Well, listen, this has been wonderful, but I really do need to get on with the rest of the business of the day, which now apparently includes this invitation back to my reunion. I think what I'll do is I'm just going to give this to Penny and let her decide what she wants to do with it, see if she wants to make it into another one of our adventures. And I think I'm actually done with this one too. Not exactly sure when I'll use this. I think I might just give this to Merle and let her keep it for a while and let her use it wherever she wants to and whenever she wants to. She's good at that. Well, listen, you go ahead, finish your coffee, take a look around, let yourself out whenever you want to. I've got to run. Bye now.